Well, welcome back to our deep dive in the PMBOK 5th edition. Now we're in Module 22 and we're into project cost management knowledge area. The first activity and the second we're going to look at here, which are planning for cost management and then actually estimating the costs of all the activities that we put into our project network diagram. So let's see what we have going on here. Project cost management. It's all about what? Well, it's about the planning, the estimating, the budgeting, the financing, which could be a very big deal, and the funding of that financing, and the managing then and controlling the costs so that the project can be completed within the approved budget. Now again, like many times in PMBOK, there are various ways of saying the same thing. So your approved budget is your cost baseline. So either one of those is an equal and acceptable term. You could see either one of those or both, maybe to try and confuse you, in a PMP question. So just understand approved budget, cost baseline. So how many processes? What are they? Well, there are 4. Of course, like every knowledge area, you have a plan for it. So here we have our cost management plan. Then we're going to estimate the costs. And when that's done, we're going to then set those in concrete at that moment in time as determine the budget as an output of that, and then control the budget from then on. So I've already put 7.1 plan cost management in the planning process group. We all should know by now all plans go in the planning process group. Where do you think estimate costs go in determining the budget? What are we doing there? Are we planning? Are we executing? Are we monitoring and controlling? Well, we're still doing our planning. So we plan our costs, we plan our budget, and then we set it in concrete, fix it, baseline it, and then we don't execute the cost. It's an inherent part of the schedule that where the work processes, when they build the deliverables, deal with the costs there, their outputs of the actuals there. So what we do then is we monitor and control the costs based on what happens in the real world. So in this module, we're going to look at these first 2 activities or processes. That's another one, activities and processes, same thing. Plan and estimate the costs. So the objective of planning our cost management is, policies, procedures, documentations, everything we need to do that is in our plan, we reference in there on how are we going to plan, manage, and expend the funds and then control the costs. All part of the cost management plan. And again, with any of these plans, remember PMBOK says depending on your project environment and the needs and requirements of your organization, all these plans, they could be formal, they could be informal, they could be whatever it is, as long as you have something that is documented somehow that you can rely on and go back to so you're consistent in what you do. And if that doesn't work, you change them and then you move on. Here's our data flow diagram. What comes in? Well, early in the project, like let's assume we are now, and again, these things happen interactively, iteratively, all together many times. So while we are doing our scheduling, preparing our schedule, network diagram, and all that, so while we're acquiring the team, while we're creating a communication plan, while we're talking to the customers about scope, we'll have our project charter come in. So it would apply there way early in the game, although it's not that beneficial at that point, but it's a resource. Now why, once we start actually getting into the build of our project, it's really important here because this has some major funding in it. The project charter says we have $2.72 million that we're going to earmark for your project. So that is a good, again, a good benchmark, sounding board for the actual costs, well, for the estimated costs that we're going to come up with here that will eventually turn into actual costs in some manner. So we keep looking at that, and if we're getting way out of whack, we may have trouble because that is when they actually start to get their funding up there, the earmark stuff, or at least they, as we'll see, they'll determine how are they going to get this chunk of money if they don't have it in the bank. So project charter is a good document to always look at from historical purposes anyway, to help you benchmark how you're doing. It's not out of whack. And of course your project management plan comes in, which has what in it? Your scope baseline, your schedule baseline now is in there. So let's say we're actually now building our product according to our schedule. We're committing funds, and again, we can't do this all at once. So let's assume that we're going to be preparing our costs now just in advance of actually baselining our schedule, which we did earlier here in this series anyway. So you should always have your costs and your durations in there with your scope and the schedule in your network diagram before you actually go off and start building things in the real world. So anyhow, when you're done, the cost management plan comes out and it's used then to guide you as you estimate your costs, because there will be things in the plan that say here's how you would do certain things, certain approaches, and that certainly then helps you determine the budget and baseline it when you get there. And externally, the only output from this process goes into risk management. So the way you are managing your costs is a very critical risk component. So that's why it goes out to help identify risks, in your cost plan. And then a quantitative analysis may use it if you opt to use quantitative analysis. You should always use an element of qualitative analysis. Remember, that's your probability matrix and that you would use to help develop your risk response plans and so on. But if you use quantitative, you'll need the cost management plan to help back that up. So the inputs, project management plan, what components, we talk about that, the scope baseline, schedule baseline, other factors in the project management plan, your risk management plan, communication management plan, of course your scheduling factors are in there. Your project charter, why do we use that, what elements, your summary budget, as we said, is in there. And anything else in the charter that may influence the way you develop and manage your project costs, you may get some information, helpful information out of that. Your organizational assets and enterprise factors, what are the enterprise factors? Again, culture, or structure of your organization. How is it structured? What's your power structure, your culture? Are you very chintzy organization? Are you flush with money? Whatever that is, that's part of the culture, and that will have a big bearing on how your funding gets achieved for your project. If you're doing foreign projects or geolocated project management, you're going to need to deal with exchange rates, because those things vary up and down all the time, and that's a factor you need to consider. And your project management information system may actually have a dedicated cost management module that you can use to help you do your costing. Your organizational assets you'd use, not any surprise. Your financial controls policy, you may have that available to you, and maybe some procedures on how you would go about achieving funding and managing it. And financial databases in your organization may have to link somehow with your costing as you spend money. So that's your inputs. Tools and techniques look rather terse here. Although they can get kind of complicated, as we can see coming up here. But expert judgment, again, call upon somebody that has skills and experience in creating your cost plan, because we're talking the cost plan here now. Look at historical information. How did they do it? So altogether, you can get some help. Here's analytical techniques. Now, this is where it gets kind of dicey here as far as you as project manager, what your involvement is, because you won't be involved in all these things. These are corporate kind of activities, most of these. If you need whatever chunk of money was authorized for you to spend on the project way back in the charter, or actually before that in your business case, where's that money going to come from? They may not have it in the bank ready to go, so they may have to either maybe they do have it in the bank, and okay, we got it, it's yours, or they may have to issue bonds. If it's that huge a project, you're doing a great big power plant somewhere, that's millions and millions and millions of dollars. So they may have to issue some stock, or stock equity or bonds to get the money in their corporation to fund your project to build that big plant. So that's all strategic organizational stuff. And remember, your project is strategic to the company, because you're doing this project for a reason for the company. So it aligns with that. And if it didn't, boy, they're not going to give you money for anything if it doesn't help them achieve one of their objectives. Financing options, when you actually get to make and buy decisions, you're going to rent, lease, anything at all on your project. You need all those kind of decisions which will affect the cost. And your financial techniques that we saw when we did project selection way back then, the same techniques here, especially if you're going to buy stuff. They need to look at the internal rate of return and return on investment, net present value, discounted cash flow, all these kind of things to make the best purchase decision. So there's a wide variety of techniques that can be used to do that. And then you need meetings. Anyone with cost responsibility that has experience, you're going to want to have, and that would include the sponsor. This is money. They're real sensitive to this, so you got to include them too. So when we come back, we're going to talk about the actual cost management plan. Okay, so there's one and only one output from this process of creating the plan, and that is the plan itself. What are the components of the plan? Well, they could be way more than this, but the basic fundamental ones are, what unit of measurement? Is it dollars? Is it lira? Is it Deutschmarks? Or euros nowadays? What is it? It could be many of these things if it's a mixed environment that you're working your project against. Level of precision, accuracy, how accurate do your estimates need to be when we estimate costs? That's an important one. That'll be in the plan. Help guide you there. WBS control accounts, that'll be discussed, and how you're going to manage money in those control accounts, how they roll up. Control thresholds. Let's just read this. The variance thresholds for your monitoring of your costs indicate the variance from the plan that is allowed before you need to take some action. So it's a threshold. So when you're looking at your control accounts, when do you have to take some action because it's not what you expect in your control accounts? Your plan will guide you into when action is necessary. Rules of performance measurement. Okay, we're going to get into earned value management calculations and the purpose and the value to you of doing that kind of thing as far as forecasting your costs. We're going to do that in a later activity here in this same knowledge area, cost, in a bit. And what kind of reporting formats do you need to report cost? That's in your plan, how you're going to do that. and cost management process descriptions. You know, you may have some process flow of how you follow this through to manage, to report costs and things. You may have something in your organization that will allow for that. So whatever it is in your cost management plan, so that when you go out and estimate, you can look at your plan and make sure you're complying with what the needs are there in the guidelines. So let's assume now we have our cost management plan. We have, you know, pretty much know what we're going to do with costing. Now we're going to actually sit down here and estimate the costs against each activity in our schedule. Coming in, of course, the scope baseline, which has your WBS activities in it, that comes in. The plan comes in as guidance. Human resource plan, because that's people costs, you know that. That comes in. The risk register comes in because there are many risks with cost that we need to deal with. Items from the environment and the organizational assets come in, and we're ready to, and of course your schedule comes in. That's the main thing you're going to put costing to. And we're ready to rock and roll with estimating the cost. The outputs are the two actual basic things: the activity cost estimates for each activity. Finally, here's your estimate of the cost of it. And a companion output project document is the basis of estimates. You know, okay, these are estimates. How did you estimate? Why did you estimate it this way? How did you come up with this number? You need to justify that so that adjustments are made later. You know, you don't do the same thing just over again if it didn't work right the first time. But you need to know how you came up with these. That's called basis of estimates. And those pump into 7.3, the next activity, which you actually then determine the budget, freeze it as the cost baseline, and then you manage to it. And of course, the activity cost estimates go out to other activities that need that information so they can do their job better. So here's our ETO diagram for estimating costs. And a comment here: our objective with estimating costs is to approximate the monetary resources that are needed to complete the project work against each and every activity in our network diagram. Notice, by the way, I didn't say in our project schedule, even though it reflects the activities in the network diagram. It is the project network diagram that gives us the best tool to be able to manage and manipulate costs and resources and time. So you always want to go back to the project network diagram when you do these kind of activities. What comes in as inputs to help us estimate costs? So obviously our cost management plan, elements of it, you know, how we're going to manage costs, what methods we're going to use, levels of cost accuracy, and a whole host of other things that we talked about earlier, as we talked about in activity 7.1, and how we're going to create and build our management plan, cost management plan. Human resource management plan is a big component because that has our people. It has staffing attributes, in particular their personnel rates, in addition to their calendar. Okay, and a big one we don't want to miss, remember, is rewards and recognitions that we talked about when we are developing our staff. We have to have it in the budget costing, even though it's not part of our project activities. It is a peripheral advantage that we as project managers have for our staff. So you remember in the work breakdown structure, you have all your actual work items broken down, and you have this one thing hanging off the side, which is project management services and so on. That won't necessarily, some elements may be in your activities, but things like rewards and recognition, you don't know when you're going to give those out. So they're just over here, but you need a cost for them and a budget included in your budget for them. So that's why the HR management plan comes in, because it will have those items in there, so we need to put money in for them. Your scope baseline, of course, comes in. Why? It is your basic work breakdown structure with all the dictionary, with all the detailed activities, where you originally, before we did the actual time management and do our activity and network diagram, that's originally where we took a swag at the cost in the dictionary for each individual discrete work item is in there. So that's why it says primary asset for estimation. You look at that and then you plug it into your activities where they're appropriate. Project schedule comes in because it itself, you know, now as a byproduct of our network diagram, it will have all your resources, including your human resources, materials resources, and don't forget finance charges. You may have some significant financing charges for things that you may need to bring in externally to support your project, so that's cost that you need to estimate. Of course, your schedule is, other than scope, your activities and resources. You have time that we put against them in our prior activity under time management, and time with humans, with materials, time-sensitive resources. Time is money, okay, right? So we need to estimate the cost for all that stuff. Here we have your risk register. Of course, it's ever present. We always have to keep that on our mind, and what components of the risk register apply towards estimating costs quite a bit, because, you know, we have our response plans in place for certain accepted risks, and should they occur, you know, we're going to have to stop. Well, maybe the project goes on, but we're going to have to, in addition, if we don't just stop and fix a problem, if that's what it takes, we're going to spend time and money to respond to a risk that has occurred in our environment to resolve it. So we put that into our reserves. And again, it can be a negative risk, a bad thing. So we spend time and money to fix the problems because of that. Or it could be a positive risk, which is good, and we need to know these things because there's a cost associated with that. So we're going to estimate the cost that we could achieve if it were an appropriate positive opportunity risk. Our environmental factors, organizational process assets, of course, come to bear. Now market conditions becomes a more significant factor as far as your enterprise factors, environmental factors, that is. Market conditions, especially if you're going to go out and get goods and services for use on your project, the market costs go up and down. If you're doing foreign exchange stuff, big problem there as far as trying to estimate proper costs, perhaps. So they really have they're a big player now when you try to estimate costs. If you're doing a lot of standard type of products you need to bring in to help you build your deliverables, you can go out and look at published information, catalogs and stuff. You can go out there and look for those to see what it costs and use that. That's analogous estimating, because it's going to be like that. So you put in $5 each into your cost. So you use published information that's out there in the wild in the environment. Internally, you may have cost estimating policies which you may need to follow, which is helpful, because that's a helpful thing on how you estimate your costs. You may have some templates that help you sort all this stuff out. And of course, your ever-present historical information and lessons learned. How did prior projects deal with costing, especially if there's similar stuff in your budget, in your project? How did they do it there? If it was similar there, what did it cost? That may be the only real key you have to help you with costing on certain items. And those are the inputs we have to help us estimate costs. So in a minute, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the tools and techniques where we can manipulate all those inputs to our advantage and produce, finally, some costing information. So we'll be back. Okay, now we're going to look at the tools and techniques that are recommended and available to us to estimate the cost given the inputs that we had in the prior activity. Again, expert judgment. You're actually going to estimate costs. Get help as you need it. Consult your experts, internal or external, to your organization. Estimating methods. You can see the blue box on the right there. I've circled the 4 popular estimating methods that we've used for time estimating, and now here we are again using it for cost estimating. Analogous, parametric, bottom up, and 3-point right here. Analogous means we're going to cost this out, estimate the cost, because it's very similar to something we did on another project, or it's something that's out there in the environment. Whatever, analogous. It's a cost like this, it's going to cost that. You may make some adjustments. For example, historical information, if you say $5,000 for a piece of equipment that we need to use in our project. Last project 2 years ago, $5,000. You're going to consult your experts and say, I think I should use this. What do you think? He said, well, they've improved that kind of device now, and if you use it, it's much less expensive. So I'd recommend $2,000 instead of $5,000. So that's how your expert judgment helps you even with analogous estimating. Parametric estimating, again, is, okay, $50 there per unit. We have 20 units here, so 50 times 20, we'll use that estimate. And then you can also apply analogous to it in the same manner. So these things are all interactive, work together just to provide you the best estimate for your costs. Bottom up, you start with your work packages. And again, you can even look at historical on this, what did it cost, but bottom up from the lowest, it may be easier to estimate costs starting with the discrete items and then working up to a larger item. And finally, we know all about by now, right, 3-point estimating. With your triangular and beta distributions, your optimistic, most likely, pessimistic estimates, and you apply one of the 2 formulas, and then you use your best known judgment or that of experts, or all together. You get a consensus. What are we going to apply a cost to, because there's still an estimate. So there we go. And the formulas, you're going to need to know these formulas. When we did time estimating, as you see here, we had a little t in front of the e in the formula. Here we have a little c, so we're talking about cost estimates. The formula is exactly the same. It's either a pure average or you weight the most likely times 4 and divide it then by 6. You need to know these formulas. They're easy. You should not have any trouble with that. By the way, you may be required to calculate some of these things on the PMP exam, and they may not put the little t or the little e in front, so you can figure out what they're talking about by the context of the question and the answers that are at hand. Obviously, if it's in hours and minutes or weeks, it's time. If it's in some kind of monetary unit, then obviously it's cost. And by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but the beta formula, the weighted most likely formula, beta, was originally used way back in the 70s, and it might have been IBM that figured this out, but it's called PERT. That's your original project scheduling methodology was PERT, Program Evaluation and Review Technique. So beta came directly from PERT, from those of you who like those little historical tidbits. So additional tools and techniques to estimate costs. Reserve analysis, we need to do that. We have our known unknowns, our unknown unknowns, and those should be rattling off your tongue pretty soon so you understand what those are again. But known unknowns are those that we do have a risk in our risk register. We've identified them, and we may have a plan to react against them if they happen. And we put money and time aside. Back when we did time estimating, we put time reserves aside for the known unknowns, for the time it takes to react to these risk events should they happen. And of course, concurrent with that, and I mentioned that back then too, that there is also obviously cost involved for you to stop, take the time, and react to these risks when the event occurs. So now we're doing the costs. You want to make sure and review your cost reserves, contingency reserves, for all the known risks that you have plans for. So, and they need to be in your budget, part of the cost baseline. Your unknown unknowns are those that you never even thought about. They're not identified, but should they occur, you do need to have some money and time set aside so that you can react to those also. And since they're nebulous, you didn't think of them, not that you didn't want to think of them, but you just didn't. So they're there. So you need to estimate, you have a good estimate, some money put aside in a management fund. Now remember, management funds are rather unprotected. They're not part of your official project budget. So who knows it's going to come along and take that money from you, because it will not directly affect your project at all if it goes away, unless you have an unknown risk event occur, and then you're using your real project funds, taking it away from other things that have earmarked those funds for, and you're using those funds instead of management reserves. So you do need some management reserves, and it's up to you as project managers to protect that money. Now as time goes on and you're managing your risk register, and you can see that the propensity for risks and the volume of risks and the danger that's involved with risk diminish over time with your project, you can release those management funds piece by piece perhaps back to the company, and they'll appreciate that a great deal. So in the end, theoretically, you'll have no management funds left. You didn't use them. Not in the cost baseline, not in the budget. Remember, cost baseline equals budget, approved budget. Oh, and here's a good thought. If you do need to use your management reserve, some event you didn't plan on happens, and you take time and money to react to it and get things back in order, whatever money you used from the management funds, you now need to issue a change request to transfer officially those monies from management into your project budget, because you've actually used them. So you need to account for them in your budget officially. That would reduce your management fund up there and increase your budget by that same amount as if it was in a contingency to begin with. That's why you need to protect the funds, because if you have zero, you can't transfer zero. It makes no difference, so be careful with that. Estimating cost of quality. Why do we consider cost of quality when we're estimating costs? Well, number of reasons. Remember, there's actually 4 components to cost of quality. 3 of them are internal. 4 of them is an external with your customer. So the internal, you do want to consider the cost of these things in your budget. Remember, prevention costs, prevention over inspection. So the prevention cost and cost of quality, which is a cost of conformance. Remember, and you got a cost of non-conformance, cost of conformance, internal, the internal piece of the conformance. Well, conformance is all internal. Prevention costs like training and adding time in your budget and cost to do it right the first time. So if you do that, you'll be good. Then also a companion to that are appraisal costs, cost to test, which could be expensive depending on what it is you're trying to test. So cost of testing, and then of inspecting your deliverables as they come through your quality processes. So you need to have those in your budget to estimate those. You should actually, even though it may be perceived as you feeling you're going to have internal failures, you still need to have some monies in a budget ready for rework in case that happens. And if you happen to scrap something, I mean, that's a total loss, so you need to redo it. So you may want to consider putting money in for that, for your internal failure costs. You're protected. And again, as the project goes on, you could reduce that to 0 and just reduce your overall project cost. The 4th component is the external cost of liabilities and warranties and lawsuits, loss of business, whatever it might be, if the customer finds a defect. Remember, that's the worst thing you want to happen, is have your customer find a defect in your work. And that's not covered here because that's a pure external cost. And basically you don't want to have money in there to say, well, if we go all the way and we totally fail, money over there. Now, what you would do, rather than put money in as under a cost of quality account, say in your costing scheme, you do want to have money for failures like that in your risk plan, in your contingencies, just in case, but it would go there and not cover it as a quote cost of quality unquote officially, because it's just a different view on things, different account, and it's perceived that you're managing risk better than assuming failure. So, okay, that's the big difference there. So that's how you would handle that 4th component which is the client finding a problem after you never did. So you want to avoid that here, but have it in your risk register and have it covered by a contingency, or by your management reserve if you never thought that it would fail like that. So either way, don't put it here, put it in your risk management side. Vendor bid analysis. This would seem pretty intuitive, if you're going to buy external goods and services for your project, they're going to cost money, and by the time you purchase them, you will know exactly, depending on the purchase vehicle, it may be still cost plus kind of things, where you have a good cost initially, but the cost plus means you're not sure if they're going to be added costs, so you're not exactly sure, but you have a good guess of what it's going to cost by looking at the vendor bids. Okay, so that's a very good source of cost estimation there. And of course it's progressively elaborated, because initially, like right now in our little scenario, we've not bought anything yet, we've just got started building the work, so we have estimates now of what our purchased products are going to cost. Pretty good estimates, I would hope, because we have all those analogous, parametric, bottom-up, and expert advice, historical databases, everything you need at hand to provide a very good estimate of it, but it's still not exact. But when you do get the bids, progressive elaboration says, okay, update your plan with the correct number, so you're spot on at that point, then with your cost for purchased goods. A couple more things to go through here. Oh, one more, group decision making. All of this stuff, like before, you call experts, do brainstorming, the Delphi technique, which is anonymous, nobody's embarrassed or called out or whatever, or is overbearing in the meeting because it's a sealed bid basically, and then you come to a consensus. And your project management software, of course, will help automate all this costing stuff and getting it into the plan, and maybe even helping you with these parametric and all these calculations and simulation tools just to help you do the best job you can to estimate your costs. Okay, we're going to take a little break, come back, and we'll talk about the outputs of all this cost estimation effort. Okay, so here are the outputs that we would expect from our efforts to estimate costs for our project. Primary outputs are your activity cost estimates and the basis of those estimates, so that we have a record of how did you estimate them, why did you estimate them that way for the record. So activity cost estimates, probable costs. Now right up front they're probable costs, that's why they call them estimates, until they turn into actuals. Okay, so probable cost, the quantitative, that's money, dollars, or other currency assessments. For your labor, for all your materials, for your contracted services, whatever it might be, anything that costs money to accomplish your project needs to be costed out, estimated, and it'll be in your activity cost estimates when you're done against each and every activity in your network diagram, which again are reflected and originated from estimates way down in the depths of your WBS dictionary. Cost contingency reserves, of course, is a cost you need to consider. Management cost reserves should be considered, but they're not going to be part of your activity cost. They'll be up above your project budget in a special account that's there, that hopefully will be there yet when you need to call on them should you have an adverse risk event that you'd never even considered. Now the basis of estimates, they define how did you estimate this, what assumptions did you make when you estimated this, what kind of constraints might have been in there. Maybe it's a plus and minus estimate. Well, we think it's this amount of money plus or minus X because we're really not sure, but it should be somewhere in there. And that could actually be your optimistic, pessimistic, most likely numbers you could put in there if that's appropriate and it's vague enough that what you're trying to estimate you just really don't know for some reason. You can do that. And it should also include what they say here is the final estimate confidence level. Just how confident are you in that estimate? Good to know, so that when the actuals come in and they're way out of whack, if you had something that said, I'm 99% sure, where you should have said, well, I'm 70% sure, so this is a real thing you need to consider. And it's valuable because it may save, some embarrassment with you and the stakeholder should an actual really come in that's way off base. If you knew that in the beginning, you can say 70% or 50% if it's that really unknown at that point, and that's okay because it is, after all, an estimate. Also, project documents are updated, in particular the risk register, because we're talking a lot about reserves and the money you need to be set aside to compensate for known and unknown events, whether they're in the activity cost estimate or above in your management reserve. So given all that, now we have our network diagram, we have the activities defined, we have the resources that are going to accomplish those defined, we have defined how long it will take to produce those activities by time, and our costing now, how much will each one of those activities cost, it's all there. You wrap that all up and now you can do a project budget and lock that down and manage to that. So we're going to look at that in Module 23 when we determine the project budget.